At 2:47 a.m., August the 3rd, 1923, by the light of a kerosene lamp, Colonel John Coolidge, a notary public, administered the oath of office to his son, John Calvin Coolidge, to become President of the United States. With the death of Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge now ascended to the top office of the land, and as Alice Roosevelt Longworth, the daughter of Theodore Roosevelt, would say, so she knows something about White Houses. She had been invited to all of the White Houses since her father had left office. She said that the difference between Calvin Coolidge's White House and the Harding White House was as different, and I quote, as different as a New England front parlor is from the back room of a speakeasy, end quote. Coolidge and Harding were night and day, whereas Harding had been the robust playboy willing to yield to his Ohio gang and to his weaker vices. Calvin Coolidge was a straight-laced Puritan. Coolidge believed that the president should maintain an air of passive deference to Congress. He's not a scrapper. He's not a person who wants to get in and mix it up with Congress. He sees himself as, yes, the defender of the public trust, but that public trust is usually expressed through Congress's will, and that he is simply there to safeguard the Constitution and that last check on the liberties of the people. He once said that, and I quote, 4/5 of our troubles would disappear if we would sit down and keep still. And this was a rule that he stringently kept. He insisted on sleeping 12 hours a day. So at night he would go to bed usually around 8 o'clock and he would sleep until 8 o'clock. He insisted on an afternoon nap, usually a 30-minute to an hour and a half nap each afternoon. As H.L. Mencken said of Coolidge, he said, and I quote, Coolidge slept more than any other president, whether by day or by night. Nero fiddled while Rome burned, but Coolidge only snored. And so Calvin Coolidge, known as Silent Cal, because he was not a man of many words. He didn't, one of the words popularized by Warren Harding was bloviation, that he could talk endlessly about any topic, whether he knew about it or not. Not Calvin Coolidge. Silent Cal would prefer to remain silent. As the story goes, while he was president, a party was held in the White House, and as Coolidge graced the party with his presence, one of the Washington, D.C. socialites who hosted the party came up to Coolidge and said, Mr. President, I've made a bet with some of the other ladies in the party that you would say more than 3 words. And Calvin Coolidge looked at her and said, you lose. Calvin Coolidge didn't spend a lot of time waxing eloquent about such, but what he did say, and his speeches are clear and concise presentations of his ideological point of view. Coolidge was not a reactionary. He's not like Harding in that Harding wanted a return to normalcy because he disliked reform. Coolidge is in fact agreed with some of the reforms of the progressives. He agreed with woman suffrage. He agreed with shorter work hours for both women and children especially. He agreed with a lot of the labor laws. But he disagreed with the greater progressive agenda. And so Calvin Coolidge is going to be a bridge within his own party and the nation, bridging progressivism to the normalcy of the 20s. In fact, as one historian said, he melded the GOP mainstream with the progressivism of TR. He restored unity within the Republican Party. In fact, one scholar says that Calvin Coolidge was, and I quote, a compassionate conservative before compassionate conservatism was cool, end quote. Calvin Coolidge, however, was passionate about a few things. One of the things that he was passionate about was parsimony, saving money. And so he would encourage Charles Dawes to cut waste wherever possible, eliminate government spending. He once announced to Congress, and I quote, "The collection of any taxes which are not absolutely required, which do not beyond reasonable doubt contribute to the public welfare, is only a species of legislative larceny." End quote. And so during the 1920s, as Congress takes in more and more money because of the roaring economy of the nation, it will be Calvin Coolidge who vetoed pork barrel project after pork barrel project. Coolidge wielded the veto and the threat of a veto to protect the public's money. Especially, he vetoed projects that would have targeted government money towards specific groups. He was able to cut taxes, especially taxes for the middle class, those earning under $10,000 a year. He stated, and I quote, "I favor the policy of economy, not because I wish to save money, but because I wish to save people. Every dollar we carelessly spend means that the life of those toiling will be made so much more meager. Every dollar we prudently save will mean that their life will be so much more abundant. Economy is idealism in its most practical form." And so to understand Coolidge is to understand his conservatism with people's money. He is the ideological forebearer of Ronald Reagan. He's, in fact, you could argue, the ideological forebearer of John F. Kennedy and Kennedy's fiscal conservatism. Coolidge comes into the White House with a nation that is rocked by the scandals of the Harding administration. And yet he brought a blunt reality, an ethical standard to Washington, D.C. that proved more effective than any president before him. After the Teapot Dome scandal broke, Coolidge ordered special prosecutors appointed, and former Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall was convicted of taking bribes. He vigorously investigated the government. Coolidge investigating the government and exposing corruption in his own party, in his own administration that he had been a part of under Harding, brought satisfaction from the people. When Attorney General Harry Daugherty interfered with the investigation, Coolidge forced him to resign. Coolidge wasn't ignorant or naive about the strategies necessary to manage a modern government. In fact, he proved to be one of the greatest administrators as president. Which is ironic that modern scholars tend to denigrate Coolidge because he didn't spend endless hours talking about what he wanted to do. He just simply did it. He did it quietly, and he went about his business. In fact, one of the best biographies written recently about Calvin Coolidge by Amity Shlaes talks about that very thing, that Coolidge mainstreamed conservatism and conservative ideas while at the same time embracing necessary reform. Coolidge once said in his approach to management and to the people he had around him, those he chose to delegate authority to, he said, and I quote, "There are many things you must not tell me. If you blunder, you can leave, or I can invite you to leave. But if you draw me into all your department decisions and something goes wrong, I must stay here. And by involving me, you have lowered the faith of the people in their government. Trusting the people he puts into office to do their job without micromanaging him. Coolidge didn't condescend. He didn't talk down to people. In fact, some of his best known quotes, the business of America is business, is actually from a much larger statement. The chief business of American business, the chief idealism of America is idealism. And so Coolidge, while not having a long litany of reforms or things that he advocated, is going to be a highly successful president. There's not volumes of Coolidge speeches. But as Amity Shlaes says, he was one of the most important presidents of the 20th century. In 1924, Coolidge decides to run for re-election. And so in the 1924 election, seeking a term of his own, he takes his Bureau of the Budget division head, Charles Dawes, and makes him his vice presidential candidate. This is going to be a three-way race. The Democrats nominate a business lawyer, John Davis, to show the flavor of the times. He's not a radical reformer. He's not a progressive necessarily. But John W. Davis, a business lawyer from West Virginia, will run against the sitting president, Calvin Coolidge, from Massachusetts. And then a third party makes its appearance, the Progressive Party of Theodore Roosevelt, back this time with its original head, Robert La Follette, as the candidate. And he's on here because he got electoral votes. He'll manage to take his own home state. And in the campaign of 1924, you can tell from the campaign literature, it's primarily a focus on personalities rather than issues. And when it comes to personality, Coolidge, who's not seen today as having a great personality, he fit the mood of the American public. And it's one of my axioms of truth that to win as president, so for those of you who want to run for president sometime in your future, or advise people who do run for president, you are going to lose if you don't have a catchy campaign slogan. How could Coolidge lose with a campaign slogan like, "Keep cool with Coolidge"? And notice the high-tech graphics of the fan blowing the words, "Keep Coolidge." You can't lose with that. That's like in the 1950s, "We like Ike." You cannot lose with that campaign slogan. And so for the candidates, and in fact Coolidge does have a platform. It's the full dinner pail, that with Coolidge's reforms and his approach to business, that the American economy is going to continue humming at a good rate, full employment, and thus you'll have money to keep your dinner pail full when you go to work. You'll have a job to have a dinner pail. The reason you had a dinner pail, we would call it a lunchbox today, is to eat lunch while you're working. So, full dinner pail was his campaign slogan. And on Election Day in 1924, he soundly seizes the presidency yet again. The Solid South remaining the Solid South, but Wisconsin breaking, the only other state to break ranks and vote for La Follette. But an easy victory for Coolidge in 1924. And so with his ascendancy into his first elected term, his second term in office, he's going to advocate a number of pieces of legislation. The first would be the Immigration Act of 1924. We've already talked about that, but reducing the amount of immigrants coming into the nation. And by the way, that was considered a progressive piece of legislation because it reduced the amount of new workers coming into the workforce, thus keeping wages inflated. Every time a new wave of immigrants came in, wages dropped because they're willing to work for less than the people who are already here. And so to keep wages up, stop immigration. And so Coolidge would advocate and sign the Johnson-Reed Act, or the Immigration Act of 1924. He would also be responsible for the Revenue Acts of 1924 and 1926, both of which reduced the income tax in all tax brackets. But probably what was hailed as one of his greatest successes, but in the long term, because of events, will seem to be disastrous, is the World War Adjusted Compensation Act. The World War Adjusted Compensation Act, or sometimes called the Veterans Bonus Bill, or just the Bonus Bill. Passed in May of 1924, Coolidge will veto it. Congress will override his veto, and so ultimately Coolidge will sign it. It created an insurance policy for World War I veterans that said that if at the end of 20 years, 1945, based upon their length of service and whether they served at home or abroad, it made an insurance policy available to them that they could cash in and get the money. Each serviceman received about $1 a day or $1.25 if they actually went to Europe. So for every day they served in the Army or the Navy, they could receive $1 to $1.25 per day for their days of service. And so this insurance bill wouldn't be payable for 20 years. And Congress overrides his veto. This is also sometimes called the Wright-Patman Act, proposed by a Texas congressman. And so he will advocate the rejection of this, and in the long run, it proved to be the right decision. He didn't like it because of the nature of the wording of the bill, and it seemed to become a handout. And on top of it all, he said, men enlisted for their patriotic duty, and is it patriotism to then be compensated for it? Now, you may not agree with that, but that was his reasoning. Let me tell you a couple of stories about Coolidge before we get into the election of 1928. Calvin Coolidge, while president, had two real passions. One passion was for cheese sandwiches. One of the quickest ways to be fired from the White House kitchen was to serve the president a processed cheese sandwich. Cheese Whiz and liquid cheeses were just coming on the market in the 1920s, and he was very much against them. He wanted Wisconsin cheddar cheese sandwiches, and he devoured them in mass quantities. So he's very passionate about his cheese sandwiches. Secondly, he was passionate about fishing. He loved fishing. But to kind of show you the character of the guy, in fishing, he believed that, and the quickest way to be kicked off of a presidential fishing trip was to use artificial bait. He believed that the act of fishing was equivalent to the hunt, and that if you caught the fish became dinner. So it was only fair that in hunting for that fish, that you use live bait so that if the fish won the contest between fishermen and fish, that the fish at least got dinner. So he insisted on the use of live bait on presidential fishing trips, and he fished quite regularly. One other story before we leave Coolidge. On his wedding night, Calvin Coolidge and this is day and time back before the modern honeymoon. If you went on a honeymoon in the 20s, it was usually after you'd been married a week or two and things had settled down from the events of the wedding, and then you went somewhere to get away. So they were in, Calvin and Mrs. Coolidge were in their house there in Boston. And as they got into bed that first night, on their wedding night, he's in his dressing gown, she's in her dressing gown. They climb into beds, one of those big feather beds. It's very high, so he literally climbs up into it. And as he got into bed, he suddenly sits bolt upright, and with an exclamation that is rare for Coolidge, he said, I forgot something. And Mrs. Coolidge's like, well, what, Cal? What did you forget? Well, he jumps out of bed and he drops to the floor, and she could hear him scooting something out from under the bed. And he works out from under the bed this massive sea trunk. Big trunk. And it's locked. He goes over to his roll-top desk, and he's fumbling around in all the drawers of the roll-top desk. And he said, I know it's here somewhere. He's like, what, Cal? What? I want to know. And he finally finds a key. And he drops down, and he opens up. And you can kind of visualize the scene. Mrs. Coolidge is on the edge of the bed, and it's like, oh, he's got something for me, a present for me that he's saved. And he told her, he said, I've been saving all of my adult life for this moment. And she's practically giddy to see what he's been saving for. And it's in this big trunk. And he unlocks it, and he throws the trunk open and reaches inside, and he pulls out one of many socks. She's perplexed. He jams his finger his hand into the sock and wiggles his finger in the hole in the end of the sock. And he said, I've been saving socks my entire adult life until I had a wife to repair them. Guys, I'm just going out on a limb and saying, that's a bad move. That's a bad move. Don't follow Calvin Coolidge in that. That could end in a divorce before the marriage is really underway. But Calvin Coolidge was parsimonious. He saved everything. He was frugal. And he was even frugal. He was frugal with his stuff and the government stuff. In Black Hills, South Dakota in 1924, the summer of 1924, on one of his fishing trips, Calvin Coolidge called a very rare press meeting of the press. And as the press poured into the hunting lodge where Coolidge was, just amazed that he had called a meeting, they await him with eager anticipation. And as Coolidge comes in, he goes to the front of the room, doesn't say anything, instead walks to the front row with a sheath of papers in his hand, and he hands the first one and then indicates that they should pass the papers down. He then walks out of the press conference. On the piece of paper was a simple phrase, I do not choose to run for the presidency in 1928. And so Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal, even says farewell to presidential politics silently. So in 1928, the office of president, with the nation's economy booming at an all-time high, with progressivism kind of on the back burners and the business of the nation being business, both parties have to pick presidential candidates. The Republicans turned to their shining star who had served in the Wilson administration, who had served in the Coolidge administration. He had been the Food Administration Director for Wilson, had been the Secretary of Commerce under Harding and Coolidge. His support of voluntary compliance, his use and cooperation with business boded well for the times. And so the Republicans turned to a former mining engineer, Herbert Clark Hoover. The Democrats, on the other hand, turned to a New York businessman, Alfred E. Smith. And so Hoover versus Smith. Smith was a businessman. You may be familiar with one of his great crowning achievements later after the presidency, his failed bid for the presidency. He's going to be instrumental in the construction of the Empire State Building. But in the day, in 1928, he was a radio announcer. He had a talk show, was a businessman, was a well-known figure. But he also was highly controversial. And so he's a surprising choice, but it kind of shows you, once again, the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time, that Republicans and Democrats both are choosing businessmen, not reformers. They're choosing people who are focused on the economy and national success at industry. And so in the campaign of 1928, you get a lot of campaign slogans, but most of them are focused on, once again, their personalities and on, in the case of Hoover, their successes. In fact, I don't see it on here, but another one of the campaign badges says, "Good times are hoovering over us." Once again, that's a pretty good slogan. Compare that with Al Smith's, that the Al spelled out as American Liberty Smith. And you got to admit, he's got some great things. Most of these badges, by the way, are housed here in the UT Tyler archives, donated by a philanthropist. We have an extensive collection of campaign memorabilia, and so you can visit the UT Tyler archives and see most of these in person. And it surprised me because the nature of the pencils you see up top, I asked a class a few years ago, so what's the thing on the top there with the bristles on it? And of course they guessed a brush. I was like, no, this is the size of a pencil. And of course it says a clean sweep for Smith. And they couldn't identify it. That is an eraser. It's used to erase typewriter print. And before the day of the auto-correcting typewriter, now the word processor, you just backspace over and it's gone. But in the day when you're typing and you make a mistake, you could advance the carriage a little bit and you take the eraser and you erase it. Well, you got all these little pieces of eraser everywhere, and you'd use the broom to brush it off so it didn't mess up your later typing. So that was one of the gimmicks they used to sell you on the candidates. Well, Al Smith proved to not be very popular, especially in the Midwest, and the nation overwhelmingly turned to Herbert Hoover. So in a stomping of Al Smith, only of the Solid South and Massachusetts going for Smith, and Rhode Island too, going for Smith. The rest is a sweep for Hoover. And so Hoover, who seemed to be, he was on the cusp. He had all the backing to be one of the greatest presidents ever. The economy is set up and seems to be ripe for continued success. He had won the nomination calling for continued prosperity, for cost cutting, for debt and tax reduction, and for the protective tariff. And so the year 1929, as Hoover enters office, he's seen as one of the greatest hopes for continued success. Hoover would say as he took office, he would say, and I quote, "I have no fear for the future of our economy." Poor Herbert Hoover is one of the most maligned presidents in American history because of future events and a horrible reputation of that his following political opponents will portray. Franklin Roosevelt shows no mercy in hammering the image of Herbert Hoover. Very much like in our own day and time. President Obama goes out of his way to attack and malign George W. Bush. And same way George W. Bush attacked and maligned Bill Clinton before him. Presidents tend to do that, but Franklin Roosevelt went after Herbert Hoover with a gusto and a vengeance that is rarely seen. But Herbert Hoover, for all of his future faults, was a humanitarian and he was a progressive. He continued income tax reductions. He took actions against corrupt patronage practices, ending some of the worst corruption in government of his day. When those outside, when the economy turns bad and protesters showed up at the White House, it had generally been the practice of the Secret Service to drive those protesters away. Herbert Hoover clearly and forcefully said it's the right of every American to protest their government. And he refused to allow the Capitol Police or the Secret Service to drive away peaceful picketers. Future events are going to really cast Hoover in a bad light with that regard, but it really wasn't Hoover's fault. Herbert Hoover had Herbert Hoover's wife was a very close friend of a black congressman, Oscar DePriest, and Mrs. Hoover and Oscar DePriest's wife were very close, and they were regular guests in the White House in a day and time in which segregation was the norm. Hoover did it because they were friends, not because he was trying to make a political statement, not because he was trying to draw attention. Oscar DePriest and his wife were over regularly. He fought for more money to be allocated for traditionally black universities and colleges. He proposed that parole boards should reflect the ethnic composition, not of necessarily the populace, but the ethnic background of the inmates. And so those deciding whether inmates should be paroled should reflect the ethnic composition of the prison population, not the population as a whole. Herbert Hoover proposed federal help through cooperative markets and high tariffs for farm products, something that even progressive presidents had shied away from. So while the economy is booming, in fact, the economy was running out of control. And so the question then becomes, the great overshadowing disaster of the Hoover administration is going to be the Great Depression and the beginnings of the Great Depression. And so the question then is, what caused the Great Depression? Well, I'm going to give you a number of reasons for the Great Depression, and one of those reasons is not the stock market. The stock market is emblematic. It's a symbol of conditions in society. The volatility of the market reflects the volatility of the economy. And so a very quick list of what caused the Great Depression, and I'll explain each one. First was overproduction. Overproduction. American companies had taken the opportunity after World War I, as they retooled from wartime production to consumer goods. They retooled with better machines and better equipment. And so nations' factories were actually producing more goods at a lower cost than ever before. And long before October 1929 and the crash of the stock market, American business had been showing that inventories of all kinds were up. In fact, in the summer of 1929, inventories of goods were 3 times larger than they had been in 1928. In fact, that kind of camouflaged the onset of the Depression. Because there are so many goods sitting in warehouses, companies had to buy more and build more warehouses, and that's going to be another cause, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But all of that construction camouflages the fact that the economy is struggling. So business inventories were 3 times as large as they had been the year before, an indication that the public's not buying the products as rapidly as they had been. And so as consumers quit buying, businesses continue producing at full tilt, and as those goods are rolling off the assembly line, they're being warehoused in newly constructed warehouses. stored in train cars on train sidings, and production of all kind continues at full steam while everything begins to clog up and back up. The second cause of the Great Depression, a lack of diversification in the economy. A lack of diversification in the economy. Prosperity had been based upon just a few key industries. One of those industries was the automobile industry. The other industry was the construction industry. And with those two, with automobile and construction carrying the economy, when they fail, there's not enough life left in the rest of the economy to carry the load. Between 1926 and 1929, expenditures on construction fell from $11 billion to $9 billion. Automobile sales declined at the same rate. By the first months of 1929, construction fell by more than a third. Automobile sales fell by 2/3. So a lack of diversification. Third, a maldistribution of purchasing power. Money remained focused in the hands of management and upper management owners, and the wealth didn't trickle down to the employees. So while they're making wages, while they're getting the goodies, it's not as much as the economy could bear. They're not getting the full value trickled down, and thus they don't have the surplus cash to buy the new products coming out. So a maldistribution of purchasing power. As industrial and agricultural production increased, the proportion of the profits going to farmers and factory workers and other consumers was too small to purchase what they were producing. As long as the corporations continued to expand their facilities, the economy flourished. A fourth reason for the Great Depression was the credit structure within the domestic credit structure. Farmers were deeply in debt. Their lands were mortgaged. Crop prices were too low to help them pay off what they already owed, and they continued to borrow more for the next season's crops. Small banks throughout the nation were in constant jeopardy of going under. In fact, throughout the 20s, even at the height of the Roaring 20s, small banks across the country were always in danger of failing. And the banking system as a whole was only loosely regulated by the Federal Reserve System. In fact, some banks failed to maintain adequate reserves and were investing recklessly in the stock market. The stock market became Vegas for not only bankers, businessmen, but the common folk. And they would begin, and one of the worst business practices they could do, people began borrowing money to invest in the market. And so the domestic credit structure set everything up so that when the shock to the system came, the banking system couldn't absorb the shock. Fifth would be the international trade structure. And we talked about this briefly with the Treaty of Versailles. But as long as the United States could loan money to Germany, for Germany to repay its reparations to Great Britain and France make their loan payments to the United States, which the United States then loaned that money back to Germany. As long as Germany and Austria could afford to borrow money, then the system worked. But once Germany and Austria reached their credit limit and defaulted on their reparations, it set off a chain reaction of collapses that ultimately resulted in the collapse of the American banking system, especially once the stock market crash hits. There's not enough liquidity in the system to absorb the shock, especially since American banks are going to take a huge hit from the international loans they've already made. And so the international debt structure. And then finally, number 6, the international trade structure. International trade formed a considerable part of the economy in the 1920s. As Europe struggled to recover from the war, they bought American goods. But as European cities recovered, and as new trade restrictions like Hoover's Hawley-Smoot tariff were implemented, it constricted the amount of goods that Europe was willing to buy, and they simply were not able to buy enough goods to absorb. And with American companies losing the international trade aspect, then they just simply were not able to have the domestic market simply couldn't absorb the rest of the products. So in the first few months of 1929, as Hoover came into office, it seemed that everything was going well. But then a housing bubble in Florida burst, a real estate bubble burst in Florida, and it set off a chain reaction of bank failures that ultimately would result in the collapse of the stock market on October 29th, 1929. But as we've already seen, all of the causes of the Great Depression were already in place. This is just emblematic that it's already here. With the collapse of the market, people were thrown in the streets, quite literally, as they couldn't afford the mortgages on their house. They're turned out of their houses. They're turned off of their farms. They have no job, so the order of the day was to establish Hoovervilles, shanties, where they lived, as you can see in the upper corner there, Hoovervilles. Now, the two pictures in the middle and to the side of the women, these are staged photographs that were taken not of, real, they are real people, but they are set up to look worse than conditions really were. But conditions were bad. In some areas like Toledo, Ohio, unemployment's 80%. Throughout Ohio, the norm was 50% unemployment, all the way up to 80% unemployment. Across the nation, unemployment reached 20 and 25%. And so as the cycle deepened, as people are laid off from their jobs, they lose the money to purchase, so that overproduction continues at an even higher level. And as people no longer have the money to buy, the economy grinds to a halt. And so people living in Hoovervilles, one of the ways as people walk down the streets, if you wanted to demonstrate, I'm not sure if I can show this. No, I can't. But you would turn out your pocket, and as you turned out your pocket, that was a sign to your fellow bums walking the streets that you had no money, that you were begging too. They were called Hoover flags. So your turned out pocket was a Hoover flag. A newspaper put over you while you slept was a Hoover blanket. I mean, Hoover was blamed for everything with regard to the Great Depression and the business failures. You see the bread lines in America, bread lines, as local communities tried to deal with the magnitude of the crisis. Help from local institutions failed, county institutions failed, state institutions failed. They turned to the federal government. Hoover would try in a limited way to give help, but it was more in the form of lines. He was ideologically predisposed to dislike the welfare system, and so it came as loans to the states or local communities, and that's simply not going to work. And so aid attempts from the Hoover administration fell far short. You can see former businessmen selling apples on the street corner just to make enough to buy bread for their family. And as if that wasn't enough, in 1939, the rains, especially in the Midwest, the rains stopped and temperatures went up, and the nation entered what became known as the Dust Bowl, a period of drought within the Great Depression. So the Dust Bowl isn't a college football game, by the way. The Dust Bowl is a period of drought in which high winds would sometimes kick up massive dust storms or black blizzards that would swallow whole towns, crushing and covering any crop that you were trying to grow. One of the greatest ecological disasters, one of the former successes was the mold-bore plow being able to break up the Great Plains. As more and more of the Great Plains are broken up and the native buffalo grasses are eliminated, well, this exposed soil that with the high winds on the plains kicked up that layer of silt, it created these black blizzards. As if that weren't enough, the black blizzards were often followed by plagues of grasshoppers. You would see it on the horizon and you think a blizzard was coming, except this blizzard hummed. And as the grasshoppers closed in and settled on the communities, they would eat everything in sight. They would eat anything green down to the ground. They would eat twine, that your clotheslines to dry your clothes. They would chew the clothes off the clothesline, then eat the clothesline, at times even gnawing on the wooden posts that held up the clothesline, held up the fence lines. They would gnaw on the clapboard siding of the houses. Just an immense plague of grasshoppers. The only good thing to say about the plague of grasshoppers is that you can eat grasshoppers. There's a lot of them to eat. Then almost in a plague of biblical proportions, and usually when you talk about the plague of grasshoppers, it's not known that the plague of grasshoppers was often followed by a plague of rabbits. Bunnies all across the Great Plains would invade communities by the millions. And communities would have rabbit roundups. And they would herd these rabbits in, and bullets cost money. You don't want to use bullets to kill the rabbits. So the community would arm themselves with clubs, and they would take a section of town and begin herding the rabbits toward their neighbors who were at the end, and they would create this great big box of people, and any rabbit they could get near, they would club. The rabbits became food. In fact, entrepreneurs tried to can rabbit and sell canned rabbit around the nation. It didn't work very well. In fact, it's if you've ever heard a rabbit scream, it is a horrific sound. Woke up one night, we live out in the country, woke up one night and thought I heard a baby crying outside the window. Well, we had a child, we had a baby. She was sleeping in her own room, but she's 2 years old at the time. I went running in there to her room. She was sleeping sound. Get back in bed, thinking maybe I'd heard something in a dream. Hear crying again. Well, I go outside, and I don't know if it was our cat or some other predator had killed a rabbit. And it was the rabbit crying, and it sounded just like a baby crying. It was disconcerting. It was so close to the sound that her own baby made when she cried. The plague of bunnies was followed by a plague of rattlesnakes. Of the two, I think I would prefer the bunnies, but a plague of rattlesnakes. Rattlesnakes by the thousands would invade communities, and that led to the creation of the rattlesnake roundup. And once again, entrepreneurs would find a way to use the rattlesnake. Canned rattlesnake became a regularly sold item. So black blizzards devastating for almost 3 years. I said 1929 through 1932. For almost 3 years, the Dust Bowl would devastate the heartland, and even continuing on in some spots far beyond that. Because of the Dust Bowl, because of the Great Depression, it set off a wave of migration as Oklahomians sought to leave their homestead and go westward to find a job anywhere. This is the theme of the Grapes of Wrath. This is the theme of Steinbeck's writings as Okies migrate. And you don't have to be from Oklahoma to be an Okie migrating. You can be from Arkansas or Missouri or Kansas or even Texas as you seek location somewhere else. Now within the Okie migration is another migration called the Great Migration. And this is poor African Americans leaving the South and migrating northward to try to find jobs to the major metropolitan centers of the North. And so the devastation of the Great Depression takes its toll, and of course Hoover receives the lion's share of the blame. And the poor Hoover trying to quiet the business depression and the drought, get the babies to sleep, and here's the Democratic donkey outside singing at the top of his voice, blaming Hoover for the weather, blaming Hoover for conditions, and even blaming Hoover, How Dry I Am is a song about alcohol, blaming Hoover for prohibition. Because remember, Hoover had been the one who said saving wheat by cutting back on alcohol production would feed the Allies. So even blaming Hoover for prohibition, which was now incredibly unpopular. Kind of the final nail in Hoover's presidential coffin came in 1932, in the summer of 1932, when the veterans from World War I organized into a march on Washington in an attempt to get an early payment of the promised bonus. Believing they wouldn't live until 1945 to receive it, they call upon Congress to pay it early. And so the bonus army descends on Congress in the spring and summer of 1932, camping around the Capitol, building Hoovervilles around the Capitol, even in the Capitol, occupying empty buildings in D.C. They demanded Congress pay the bonus early. Congress, after the midterm elections of 1930, after the economy collapsed, the Democrats controlled Congress, and they saw in the bonus army a way to nail Hoover's political coffin shut. They refused to act on the bonus. And so Congress adjourns, offering to pay the veterans transportation anywhere they wanted to go, but Congress adjourns and goes home, leaving the protesters in D.C. with Hoover. After a series of near disastrous fires in buildings occupied by the veterans in D.C., campfires that got out of hand and threatened to burn down Washington, D.C., President Hoover ordered the removal of the veterans from abandoned buildings in D.C. He did not order the mass eviction of veterans from around D.C., but he tasked the Capitol Police, supplemented by the U.S. Army, under the leadership of Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur, to encourage the veterans to leave. MacArthur, in an incredible display of excessive use of force and exceeding orders, and you can see in the lower side the tanks driving down Pennsylvania Avenue in a display of force. World War I era tanks used against men who just a decade before had been driving those tanks in defense of the nation. Soldiers currently in the Army using atom sight gas and tear gas against veterans who had experienced those same gases on the trenches in World War I, driven from the buildings, and then exceeding his orders, MacArthur ordered the Army to drive the veterans out of their Hoovervilles. And in the ensuing fight, veterans were killed. Even a baby, because some of these marchers brought babies with them, their families with them. A baby was killed. A number of protesters were killed. Hundreds of protesters were injured. And as the nation watched the spectacle of the Army fighting against veterans, Hoover's fate is sealed. And so the Democrats turn to their shining star, Franklin Roosevelt, to bring victory in the election of 1932, where we'll start next time.